25 years ago, tomorrow, Governor George Wallace stood in the Schoolhouse Door at the University of Alabama to keep 2 black students from registering.
While most students enrolling at the University of Alabama in 1963 hoped to distinguish themselves in some way, Vivian Malone and James Hood were to be remembered just for showing up. A defiant Governor George Wallace and a battery of state troopers met the students, who were shepherded by Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach.
Now therefore I, George C. Wallace, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
Governor, I'm not interested in a show. I don't know what the purpose of the show is. I am interested in the orders of these courts being enforced. That is my only responsibility here. And I'll ask you once again, will you give me the assurance that you will step aside and peacefully do your duty? Very well.
When faced with the National Guard, Wallace eventually did step aside. For Vivian Malone, it was time to leave the spotlight.
Well, I would just like to say that I'm glad that the registration is over and everything is over now. I think we can get down to studying. This is our main purpose here.
2 months later, James Hood dropped out. In 1965, Vivian Malone became the first black graduate of the University of Alabama.
And today, Vivian Malone Jones has returned to her alma mater for a conference on race relations in America. She joins us live from the University of Alabama, where 25 years ago, George Wallace tried to keep her out. Good morning, Vivian. How are you?
Good morning, Harry. I'm fine.
When you think back to that day 25 years ago, what goes through your mind?
Well, first of all, it was a very, very hot day, and of course we had some apprehensions about that. Just the heat alone created a certain amount of tension as we sat in those cars, in that car waiting for the governor to read his proclamation and ultimately to step aside.
Were you afraid?
Well, no, not really afraid, but I think there was a lot of apprehension on my part about not only my personal security, but also about my ability to stay in that environment.
What was it like to be in that environment day after day after day for 4 years?
Well, first of all, there was a certain amount of isolation on our part. I remember one day as I sat in class, and one of the professors asked anyone who didn't want to be there, they could leave. And of course, many of my class members did leave. And of course, if you notice in some of the pictures, I'm seated over to one side of the classroom by myself.
How did you sustain yourself in an atmosphere like that?
Well, one of the things that I did was I had made a determination before I came to the University of Alabama that I knew that I would find these kinds of things happening. I'd even prepared myself for the worst. So many of the things that happened, because I had expected them to happen, I was certainly able to endure and withstand them.
A lot of courage. Sociologists had said that about Southern colleges, they may be desegregated these days, but they're not integrated. Do you believe that's really true still?
I think that's very true. I think even today, as black students are on campuses, they are there without the benefit of being integrated into the fabric of the society. I think that's true whether it's on campuses or whether you're in the world of work, that you are there, but you never really get an opportunity to truly become a part of that campus. And it's always interesting as I talk with young people, young black students today, that many of them feel some of the same kinds of things that I felt 25 years ago.
As you're there in Tuscaloosa, is there a degree of frustration inside with a lack of progress over the last 25 years?
Well, there has been some progress. When we look at the University of Alabama with its 10% of its population, student population being black, of course that's progress from 25 years ago when there was only one about this time in 1963. So there has been progress, but I still think that there is still a lot for us to do. When we look at faculty, we look at the tenure process, we look at boards of trustees and that kind of thing throughout, I guess throughout the country. We realize that there is a lot more that can be done.
It's a long road to go. Vivian Malone, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
25 years ago, a dramatic confrontation took place when Governor George Wallace unsuccessfully attempted to keep two blacks from attending the University of Alabama. CNN's Susan Lesovich reports the university is now conducting a forum on how to improve race relations.
The state of Alabama.
It's an infamous scene in civil rights history, commonly known as the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door. Governor George Wallace, in defiance of a federal order, tried to block two black students from entering the all-white University of Alabama. That sweltering day on June 11th, 1963, changed Vivian Malone Jones' life.
No one should be denied that right, you know, who otherwise met all the requirements. So I felt that it did, in fact, open doors for others.
Indeed, 25 years later, the first black graduate of the University of Alabama was met with a different response at the university, which is marking the event with a 3-day conference on race relations in America. One of the most telling signs of progress in that area was the taped response by the former governor himself, who was too ill to attend.
I stood there and kept peace, but it's still with the bad public relations I said, I'm sorry I did it that way.
Nicholas Katzenbach, the former assistant attorney general who squared off with the governor in that memorable encounter, is still bitter.
He's been in many ways a better governor than I would have given him credit for, but I guess I still resent what he did on that day.
Foster Auditorium is no longer a center of university life, but the confrontation that took place at its doorstep 25 years ago has resulted in significant change. 1 out of every 10 University of Alabama students is now black.
Most of those students weren't born 25 years ago, and only some of them care about the history made here.
I really don't know much about it. I'm sorry.
They set an example for us to follow. They were courageous, and they give us something to fight for, something to strive for.
College President Joab Thomas says more work remains.
We do not have nearly the number of black faculty and staff that we should have.
That may improve with the rising number of black students attending the University of Alabama. Susan Lesovich, CNN, Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
This is the 25th anniversary of George Wallace's unsuccessful stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. He was the governor then, and he was trying to keep black students from registering for classes. This weekend, Alabama is marking that moment by sponsoring a conference on race relations. NBC's Douglas Kiker reports on how much things have changed in a quarter century in Alabama.
Last fall, Alabama football. All-American Bobby Humphrey, a favorite of Crimson Tide fans. He's black, mostly they're white. And 25 years ago, few people in Alabama could have imagined such a scene as this. 1963, Governor George Wallace attempts to prevent the racial integration of the University of Alabama by federal authorities.
And hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
It didn't work. President John Kennedy nationalized the State National Guard, and 20-year-old Vivian Malone went about getting an education. Today, the wife of an Atlanta doctor and the mother of 2 college kids, Vivian Malone Jones says she was a little nervous back then, but she'd do it again.
There's no doubt in my mind that if I were faced with the same situation in 1988, that I would go through it again.
Today, she wouldn't need the National Guard. The University of Alabama is totally integrated with 1,700 black students, 10%.
This campus is better integrated, I think, than many campuses in the country, better than most.
This weekend at the university, there was a reunion of sorts of the people who played roles in that dramatic event a quarter of a century ago. George Wallace did not attend the Symposium on Race Relations in America. His health is not good. But Wallace long ago accepted defeat on this issue. He even crowned the first black university homecoming queen.
I believe it was in the best interest of white and black to be in a segregated school system. But I was wrong, and once we lost the legal battles, I think we all saw we were wrong.
Dr. Rose, university president at the time, says the school was caught in the middle of a political confrontation.
We were caught between a rock and a hard place. Of course, as you know, Governor Wallace was pretty stubborn about keeping us segregated. John Kennedy and Bob Kennedy were determined that we were going to integrate that day.
Tuscaloosa banker George LaMeda organized local businessmen and tried to keep the peace.
We had what amounted to a political campaign going solely for the purpose of asking George to stay away.
But George Wallace did not stay away. The man he confronted was Nicholas Katzenbach, the Assistant U.S. Attorney General sent from Washington to help the black students register for class.
I was annoyed at the show to get two kids into college. I was annoyed at the fact that Governor Wallace wanted to exploit race on national television the way he did. And I was annoyed that he stood in the shade and I stood in the sun.
June the 11th, 1963.
Racial prejudice and social segregation still exist here, but there are very few people in Alabama today who would like to see things back the way they were 25 years ago when George Wallace stood in this doorway proclaiming no blacks allowed. Douglas Kiker, NBC News, at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa.
Here at home, an historic confrontation over racial segregation in this country is being remembered at the University of Alabama by those who were there in 1963 and those who have followed. Mark Potter reports.
For the students today at the University of Alabama, the civil rights struggle is now a collection of faded images and echoes from history class.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
But for those who were there 25 years ago, Governor Wallace's inaugural pledge and his stand 6 months later in the university's Schoolhouse Door were momentous events.
The unwelcomed, unwanted, unwarranted, and force-induced intrusion upon the campus of the University of Alabama.
Defying a court order that the university be desegregated, Wallace tried, at least symbolically, to block the enrollment of students James Hood and Vivian Malone.
I felt that I had a right to be here. I mean, I've been a resident. I was born and raised in the state of Alabama, and there was no reason why I shouldn't have been here.
Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach was sent by President Kennedy to face off the governor.
Governor, I'm not interested in a show. I don't know what the purpose of the show is.
I was determined that the two young people would not, once on the campus, they would not leave it.
After Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard, Wallace stepped down. There was no violence, but the students enrolled under heavy guard.
It's significant because you have a vivid confrontation between federal and state authority on a great moral issue.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue.
That night, President Kennedy gave a major address on civil rights, but it was undercut several hours later by the murder of civil rights leader Medgar Evers in Mississippi.
The Evers killing was a harsh reminder that while the event here at the University of Alabama was a milestone in the civil rights movement, it was only a beginning.
The door has been opened, and it's gradually opening, but it has not opened all the way.
This week, the university, which is now 10% black, is hosting a national conference to discuss shortcomings in race relations and to mark the events of 25 years ago.
I think it serves and ought to serve as a beacon for the rest of the world that change can occur. We should remember the pain and we should remember the suffering, but we should remember equally the success.
Mark Potter, ABC News, Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Students and officials involved in Governor George Wallace's historic stand in the Schoolhouse Door 25 years ago returned to the University of Alabama today. The school is sponsoring a conference on race relations to commemorate the anniversary of the event. And those who played key roles in the desegregation of the university returned to campus to reflect on what happened. One of them is Nicholas Katzenbach, the man who confronted Wallace as he tried to keep the university's first 2 black students from attending classes.
Know what Governor Wallace would do. We suspected, we hoped, we tried to get commitments, but we didn't know what he would do for certain, and we didn't know whether he could do what he said he was going to do.
And in later years, Wallace conceded he was wrong, and he won the support of many blacks during his last term in office. The former governor was invited to the conference, but he declined the invitation. As we told you earlier, in Tuscaloosa, they are remembering the 25th anniversary of George Wallace's stand on the schoolhouse steps, and now we are going to go live to Tuscaloosa with Angie Casey.
As a matter of fact, I understand, Angie, that you have one of the key players in that Schoolhouse Door and eventual integration of the University of Alabama.
That's right, Bob. With me is Vivian Malone. She was one of the first blacks who walked through the Schoolhouse Door, one of the first to be admitted to the university, and the first black to graduate from the University of Alabama. Ms. Jones, would you please tell us, it must have taken you a great deal of courage to do what you did 25 years ago. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, primarily because of the degree that I was interested in. I was trying at that time to obtain a degree in accounting. And of course, none of the black state schools offered that, so the University of Alabama was the one. Now, why did I choose to go through the rigors? Because I felt it was the mood of the times. I think there was a lot of change going on, and of course, by the time I entered the university, it was the last Southern university to be desegregated.
And did you realize at the time the impact that this would have on the history of the state of Alabama and the nation as well?
Well, by the time I was here on that day where the governor did take his stand, of course, you know, I obviously had to realize that. I think when I initially applied at the Extension Center in Mobile, I didn't attach as much significance to it.
Were there times here at the university when you wanted to give up and perhaps wondered if it was all worth it?
No, there never was. I'd gone through too much at that time to even entertain the idea of giving up.
Okay. I am sure there were some who made your stay here at the university less than pleasant. At the same time, were there those who supported what you were trying to do?
Of course. As a matter of fact, I even had some professors that were supportive, my advisor. On the other hand, I had some professors I thought were unfair, but that's life. And that was in no way deterred me in terms of my efforts to stay here and complete my studies.
And this conference is all about race relations. Is there something in particular, a particular message you would like to bring to those who are attending this conference?
Well, basically, I think it's all about a choice and a person's right to try to do the best that they can do wherever, and to have that, not have that right denied to them. And I think as we here during this weekend look at where we are, I think we'll try to see that even more doors are being opened for everyone.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jones, for joining us. And Bob, like I said, this symposium will continue through Saturday, and several more of the key players will be participating in the 3-day event.
Thanks a lot, Angie Casey. Via satellite, live from Tuscaloosa. We'll have more on the conference in later newscasts.
It'll be 25 years ago tomorrow when Governor George Wallace made his infamous stand in the Schoolhouse Door in an effort to block integration. The University of Alabama is marking that occasion with a national conference on race relations. As Tuscaloosa Bureau Chief Dan Case reports, many of the participants in that dramatic confrontation returned to the capstone today.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures,
And what a moral issue it was. On one side, Governor Wallace attempting to block 2 black students from entering the university. On the other side, the government and federal troops telling him he was wrong.
I take it from that statement that you are going to stand in that door and that you are not going to carry out the orders of this court.
Vivian Malone was one of those students. She went on to become the school's first black graduate. Today she returned and said forgiving Wallace is difficult.
And I have never understood to this day that a governor could feel that he was right to deny me or anyone else my constitutional right.
Wallace declined an invitation, but on a taped interview apologized for what happened. But the man who confronted Wallace also finds it difficult to forgive.
I think it was tragic that he was injured, as he was in that assassination attempt. And with all of that said and done, I'm not a great admirer.
Those people on both sides of the 1963 confrontation admit that a lot of what happened here was nothing more than a show, and the university found itself an unwilling participant. At the time, they already had a desegregation plan in the works, so as a result, 25 years later, they find themselves working hard at public relations, trying to keep the emphasis on the future instead of the past. In Tuscaloosa, Dan Cates, WBRC 6 News.
Former Alabama President Frank Rose told the group today that Wallace's political stand back in 1963 was greatly influenced by the Ku Klux Klan. Rose was one of 6 people who addressed the conference today.
Tomorrow will mark the 25th anniversary of Governor Wallace's infamous stand in the Schoolhouse Door, when he unsuccessfully tried to block the admission of 2 black students to the University of Alabama. The university is marking the occasion with a national conference on race relations. Many of the participants in that dramatic confrontation returned to the campus today, including Vivian Malone Jones, who went on to become the school's first black graduate. Ms. Jones says her experience in 1963 was a positive move for blacks, but says much more progress needs to be made.
But as I look at it as an EEO officer, the masses of black people still occupy the lowest level, the least prestigious jobs wherever they happen to be.
Governor Wallace was invited to attend the conference but declined because of poor health. There's going to be lots of looking back and remembering for the next 3 days at the University of Alabama campus. Pam Huff joins us live now from Tuscaloosa. Pam?
Thank you, Gene. This Saturday, June the 11th, will mark the 25th anniversary of what has come to be known as a benchmark in the civil rights struggle in this country. Of course, it was on that day that, here in Tuscaloosa, that former Governor Wallace made his stand in the Schoolhouse Door. Joining me now is a man who is writing a book about that particular struggle. His name is Cully Clark, and you are a professor here at the university. I understand that, as history shows, the university was already implementing its own integration policy at that time. Why didn't the governor wait?
Well, I think the governor felt that he had a political constituency to represent. And I think that we also ought to add into that equation the fact that there was no greater political stage in America in June of 1963 than this campus.
So what happened to this campus once this had already taken place, the stand was over, history had been made? How did the university go about accepting the students here?
Well, the university had excellent plans in place to desegregate the institution, and through the 70s it continued to desegregate. And then I think in the late 70s and certainly into the 80s, we've moved closer to the ideal of integration.
Dr. Clark, on this symposium that we will be seeing so much of for the next 3 days, you're going to try to stress that a lot is happening that is good now in race relations in this country. How do you see race relations now as you look back over the past 25 years? Have we made progress, or have we put a veneer over everything?
Well, I think no one can doubt that we have come a long way in 25 years. As Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe bends to justice, but we must remember we've got to help it.
All right, thank you very, very much for joining us, Dr. Cully Clark. Tonight at 10 o'clock, we also will have 2 other members who had a great part to play in that day back 20 years ago. Gene?
Okay, thank you very much, Pam. We'll hear from Pam again tonight at 10 o'clock.
Alabama's leading news station. This is Channel 13 News Tonight with Pam Huff, Gene Lively, Jerry Tracy, and Ken Lass.
Now being mindful of my duties and responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the state of Alabama and seeking to preserve and maintain the peace and dignity of this state and the individual freedoms of the citizens thereof, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
A scripted, planned, historic moment in Alabama, an incident seen, heard, and remembered around the world. 25 years ago, when former Governor George Wallace made his stand in the Schoolhouse Door at Foster Auditorium here on the campus of the University of Alabama, the world saw it as one voice speaking for an entire state opposed to an inevitable change. By that time, it was obvious integration would be achieved, like it or not. In truth, the university already had a desegregation plan in the works. The school got caught in the middle. So did a young woman named Vivian Malone, now Vivian Malone Jones, who was one of the first of 2 black students enrolled on this campus. And tonight she joins me again from the University of Alabama campus here in Tuscaloosa. Miss Jones, you must have been frightened at that time. You really didn't know what was going to happen. What made you have the stamina and the strength to want to be able to go through with that?
Well, first of all, it had been something that I had decided some 3 years earlier. So by the time that the decision had been reached in the courts, of course, I felt that I was mentally and physically prepared to come to the university.
Regardless of what happened?
Regardless.
Now, you look back over the rest of your life. Now, this was 25 years ago. You graduated from here, you got married, you live in Atlanta now, you have a daughter ready to go to college. Where do you put what happened here as far as the history of your life is concerned? How important was it to you?
Well, it was very important because I made a decision and I followed through, just as some other decisions in my life. Now, one of the things that happens over the years, as you look back on in 25 years, you try to put things in perspective. Sometimes I think it's even more important to me now, perhaps, than it was then, because at the time I was really only interested in attending college and pursuing a major that I was interested in. But I look back on it now, it's changed a lot of lives.
Yes, it certainly has. And now your daughter is ready to go to college. She is not coming here. Where is she going?
Well, I tried to persuade her, but she decided to go to Howard University in Washington.
And good school, too. Thank
Yes.
you very much for joining us here tonight.
Thank you.
Jean, actually, the University of Alabama does not want this anniversary commemorated as a thing of looking back. In fact, tonight was only the beginning of a 3-day seminar in which they're going to talk about the future of race relations here in this country, again, emphasizing the positive as opposed to the negative past.
Okay, thank you very much, Pam, for that report live from Tuscaloosa. 25 years ago tomorrow, George Wallace's stand in the Schoolhouse Door marked the end of official segregation at the University of Alabama. Today, several of the key figures in that drama shared their reflections on that day of conflict and change. David Smith reports from the conference opening doors, an appraisal of race relations in America.
Thereof, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
25 years after these schoolhouse doors were made famous, this campus is now open to all. But how much in that quarter of a century has really changed, and how much has stayed the same? Today, some of the key players from that event took a look back. Nicholas Katzenbach was the man Bobby Kennedy sent to Alabama to confront George Wallace.
But we didn't know what he would do for certain, and we didn't know whether he could do what he said he was going to do. He did, as you've heard, speak out about violence. He did urge people to keep off the campus, but everything else that he had created was really in conflict.
George LeMeister had worked to convince business leaders and Governor Wallace to avoid violence. He notes that Wallace was, in a sense, fulfilling his campaign promise.
As you remember, Governor Wallace didn't decide in June 1963 that he would put himself between the order of the judiciary and the university and stand on what he called constitutional rights. He made that threat during his campaign.
Vivian Malone, who says she simply wanted to be an accountant, but became the university's first black graduate.
I think we've witnessed a lot of progress over the past 25 years, but as I look at it as an EEO officer, the masses of black people still occupy the lowest level, the least prestigious jobs wherever they happen to be.
And so it is on this campus 25 years later. The university is integrated academically, yet socially remains largely segregated. Even here, the more things change, the more they seem to remain the same. From the University of Alabama, David Smith, Channel 13 News.
Officials say George Wallace was invited to attend the conference, but he declined due to his poor health. Some of the key players in the famous stand in the Schoolhouse Door of 1963 today reflected on that event in civil rights history. It was 25 years ago tomorrow that Governor George Wallace tried to block integration at the University of Alabama. Nicholas Katzenbach was the man that Bobby Kennedy sent to enforce the federal court's integration order. Katzenbach says that he was very nervous about what Wallace might do, but he was determined to avoid violence. Vivian Malone Jones eventually became the first black to graduate from the university. She says much has changed in 25 years, yet much has remained the same.
I think we've witnessed a lot of progress over the past 25 years, but as I look at it as an EEO officer, the masses of black people still occupy the lowest level, the least prestigious jobs wherever they happen to be. Now we see a fewer people who've made it into the door, and when we talk about opening doors here today, the door has been opened. And it's gradually opening, but it has not opened all the way. And I'm very...
George Wallace was invited to attend the conference, but he was too ill to attend.
Good evening. Phil and Renee have the night off. In our news at this hour, this weekend marks the 25th anniversary of George Wallace's unsuccessful stand in the Schoolhouse Door at the University of Alabama. He was the governor then, and he was trying to stop black students from registering for classes. This weekend, the university is marking the moment by sponsoring a conference on race relations. And as Roy Wood reports tonight, a lot has changed in 25 years.
On June 11th, 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway of the university attempting to block the racial integration of the school by federal authorities.
Do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
But it didn't work. President John Kennedy nationalized the state National Guard, and 20-year-old Vivian Malone entered classes to begin her college education. Today, she's a wife and mother of 2 college kids. Vivian Malone Jones says she was a little nervous back then, but she'd do it again.
There's no doubt in my mind that if I were faced with the same situation in 1988, that I would go through it again.
Today, she wouldn't need the National Guard. The University of Alabama is totally integrated with 1,700 black students, 10%. This weekend at the university, there was a reunion of sorts of the people who played roles in that dramatic event a quarter of a century ago. George Wallace did not attend the Symposium on Race Relations in America. His health is not good. Wallace apparently, however, accepted defeat years ago on the issue of segregation. He even crowned the first black university homecoming queen.
I believed it was in the best interest of white and black to be in a segregated school system. But I was wrong, and once we lost the legal battles, I think we all saw we were wrong.
Some forms of racial prejudice and social segregation still exist, but there are very few people here today who would like to see things back the way they were 25 years ago when Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door proclaiming no blacks allowed. Roy Wood, Channel 13 News, tonight.
A staunch segregationist, Wallace was forced to make a stand. Only months before the confrontation, in his inaugural address, he had declared segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Meanwhile, a conference at the University of Alabama is gaining nationwide attention as dignitaries gather for 3 days to discuss the changing face of race relations in America. The conference begins tonight, and today Greg Hagler has a preview.
It was 25 years ago this week that George Wallace tried to keep Vivian Malone from enrolling at the University of Alabama. The stand in the door of Foster Auditorium was a futile effort, and Wallace later peacefully stepped aside, and a new era of race relations began, not only at the university, but indeed the rest of the nation as well. Today, the Bryant Conference Center was being prepared for a major national conference on race relations entitled Opening Doors, an Appraisal of Race Relations in America.
I wanted to do something to, not to recognize or to celebrate the event, but rather to observe it appropriately.
USA Today featured conference-related topics on its op-ed page today, an indication of the national interest in this weekend's activities at the capstone.
Well, I think it's just an excellent way for the University of Alabama to remember a dramatic moment in its history, and to remember it in a way that declares it a success.
This being the 25th anniversary of Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door, university officials say they knew attention would once again be focused here. But with the conference, they say this time that attention will be positive. Greg Hagler, 33 Eyewitness News.
The conference begins tonight at 7 o'clock. We will have a full report tomorrow. Good evening. The University of Alabama's National Conference on Race Relations continued today and drew a large crowd at the Bryant Conference Center.
The three-day event, which will conclude tomorrow, features eminent scholars and historians discussing the progress of minorities in our society. Rick Blackwell has the story.
Vivian Malone was trying to become one of the first blacks to enter the University of Alabama. Assistant Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, under orders from President Kennedy, was there to ensure integration. Then Governor Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door made history back in June of '63. One day before the incident's 25th anniversary, the event was replayed in front of a large group, taking part in the Capstone's National Conference on Race Relations. The key players that day were in attendance, except for Wallace, who declined the invitation due to health problems.
Well, of course, I resented his standing in the schoolhouse door. I felt that as a student and a resident of the state of Alabama that I certainly had a right to attend the university. And
I think Governor Wallace has lived and breathed politics all of his life, and with all of that said and done, I'm not a great admirer.
The three-day symposium will feature noted scholars on the history, current status, and future for improving race relations in America.
Getting back in touch with the kind of pain that we had to go through with desegregation, that they will be inspired to work into the future.
It's always a smart PR move to turn a negative incident, like the anniversary of the Wallace stand-in, and turn it into something positive. In this instance, this symposium on race relations makes us take a hard look at the mistakes of the past and the possible solutions of the future. Rick Blackwell, 33 Eyewitness News.
Today marks the 25th anniversary of former Governor George Wallace's infamous schoolhouse stand. In 1963, Wallace attempted to block two black students from entering the University of Alabama by standing in the doorway of Foster Auditorium. Today also marks the end of a three-day symposium on race relations at the Capstone. It's being held at the university's Bryant Conference Center. This morning's guest speaker was Dr. Rhoda Johnson, Associate Professor and Chairperson of the Women's Studies program at the UA. Johnson spoke to a crowd of nearly 100 on the topic of intersecting race, class, and gender in society. She highlighted specific strategies for change in those areas. Johnson also mentioned several important changes that she's noticed since the Wallace incident 25 years ago.
There are also some other changes that have occurred which are more subtle and difficult to document. The positive feelings that people have about seeing blacks in faculty positions on campus. And yet, on the other hand, there are not a large number of faculty members, not a large number of blacks in leadership positions in the state. So that you have both positives, and there's still very much a need for change.